The chair of the Professional Conduct Committee held my brother's evidence folder for exactly 4 seconds. Exactly 4 seconds before the color drained completely from her face. She stood from the table. She pressed the folder against her chest like it contained something contagious, and then she walked out of the hearing room without saying a single word to anyone. My brother, Gavin, turned and gave my parents the small, victorious nod of a man who had already planned his celebration dinner. My father sat with his arms crossed, the particular posture he reserved for boardrooms and moments he needed the room to understand that he was its most important occupant. My mother wore a silk blouse in dusty rose, and her expression of practiced concern, the one she deployed at charity galas when photographers were near. I sat at the respondents' table with my hands flat on the cool surface, and I did not move. Because I already knew what was in that folder, and I already knew what happened when someone examined it carefully. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday in early November, delivered by a process server to my firm's address on 8th Avenue SW. Calgary in November has a particular kind of cold that comes from inside the buildings as much as outside, a stillness that precedes something. I felt it the moment I opened the package. It was a formal complaint to CPA Alberta's Professional Conduct Division. It named me as the respondent. It requested my immediate suspension on the grounds that my CPA designation had been obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation, falsified transcripts, a fabricated articling record, a certification letter that was never actually issued. Gavin's name was at the top of the primary complaint. Beneath his signature were 2 supporting affidavits. My parents. Both signed under oath. I sat at my desk for a long time after that, long enough that the light outside my window shifted, and the Bow River caught the last of the afternoon. Then I picked up my keys and drove north toward the Petroleum Club. The valet took my car without looking at it. Inside, the air was thick with the particular smell of that room. Roasted lamb and old wood paneling, and the quiet confidence of people who have never once had to wonder whether a transfer would clear in time. My father and mother had a standing reservation at the same corner table. It had been theirs since the early days of his real estate development company, when he'd closed his first major project, Kensington, and decided he'd arrived somewhere worth staying. My mother had a glass of Chardonnay. My father was reviewing something on his phone, unbothered. I walked to the table and placed the complaint package face up beside his bread plate. Neither of them flinched. My mother set down her wine with careful precision. She glanced at the couple seated 2 tables over before she spoke, dropping her voice to the register that carries exactly far enough. She said that she and my father were doing this because they were worried about me. That running a solo practice was clearly taking a toll. That they didn't want to see me embarrass myself further, or worse, hurt someone who trusted me. My father put down his phone. He said this wasn't personal. He said that the family name was connected to Gavin's firm, to his business interests, and to the work he had built for 30 years. He said that my clients were largely lower-income individuals and small business owners who deserved a professional with proper standing, and that if I actually cared about them, I would wind down the practice quietly before the process became public. He said I was welcome to come work in the administrative side of his development company, if I needed income. He said it the way he said everything, with the absolute certainty of a man who has never had a door closed in his face. I looked at the 2 people sitting across from me. I had driven all the way here because some small part of me still believed there might be a misunderstanding. That their names on those affidavits were a mistake. That they had been pressured somehow. There was no misunderstanding. I picked up the envelope. I walked through the dining room and the lobby and out into the November cold. I sat in my car for a moment with the engine running and the heater on, and the city's reflecting off the wet asphalt. Then I put the car in drive and went to work. Gavin was meticulous about his image. He had been all his life. The right firm, the right profile in the Calgary Herald business section, the right way of appearing in photographs beside people with money. He would not have filed something this intricate and this risky unless he was already desperate. The question was what he was desperate for. I found Tanner through a referral from a client who dealt in the kind of business disputes where you sometimes needed to know the truth before you asked a lawyer to prove it. Tanner worked out of a modest suite in the Beltline, drove an unremarkable car, and had the patience of someone who had spent years waiting for people to make predictable mistakes. We met at a coffee shop on 17th Avenue. He ordered black coffee and didn't touch it. He told me to give him 48 hours. He came back in 36. He spread everything on the table between us. Gavin's firm had been selected for a practice inspection by the Canadian Public Accountability Board. An audit triggered by a client complaint about investment account discrepancies. The inspection was scheduled for the following Monday. Tanner's source, who worked in the building's property management and had access to scheduling systems, confirmed that Gavin had been in his office 4 times in the past 2 weeks after 10 o'clock at night. 3 of those nights corresponded directly to the creation dates on the fraudulent documents submitted in my complaint. The financial picture came together with horrible clarity. Gavin's firm managed discretionary portfolios for a handful of high-net-worth oil and gas families. He had moved approximately $620,000 from those client accounts over 18 months, never all at once, never in amounts large enough to trigger automatic flags, to cover catastrophic personal losses on a private equity position in a Permian Basin energy company that had since collapsed. The money was gone, the CPAB audit would find it. But here was the trap he was building. If CPA Alberta suspended my designation, my practice would be placed under emergency supervision. A custodian, an appointed practitioner, would be assigned to manage my client files and trust accounts. Gavin intended to petition for that custodianship. My clients included several wealthy individuals with pending estate settlements, large business sale proceeds held in trust, and multi-year tax planning arrangements with significant liquid assets. He planned to move fast, access those accounts before the CPAB auditors closed in on his own firm, and use my client's money to temporarily restore what he had stolen from his. He was going to steal from the people I had spent years serving. He was going to do it with my name still on the door. Tanner slid a USB drive across the table. On it were 2 photographs. One taken with a telephoto lens from the parking garage across from Gavin's building, showing him entering the lobby at 11:47 p.m. on the night the fraudulent documents were created. The second was a high-resolution image of the building's paper sign-in log from that same night, obtained from a contract security officer who had accepted $400 in cash and would not be reachable afterward. Gavin's signature was on the page in his unmistakable left-leaning print. I slid an envelope across the table. Tanner put it in his jacket pocket without looking inside. He told me to be careful. He said that in his experience, people who commit fraud to save themselves have no floor. They go to whatever depth they have to before they stop. He said he was going to visit a friend on Vancouver Island for a while, and that I should not call his number for any reason. He stood up and walked out into the gray afternoon. I stayed at the table with my coffee. I thought about the day I passed my CFE, the common final examination, 3 days of writing, the hardest professional test in the country, the last gate before a CPA designation. I had studied for 11 months while working part-time doing junior bookkeeping at a downtown firm. I passed in the first sitting, in the top 10% of national writers that year. I called my parents that evening. My father answered. I told him. He said, "Good." I heard Gavin's voice somewhere in the background. He was there for dinner, apparently, and my father covered the receiver for a moment and said something I couldn't make out. Then he told me he had to go. There was company. The convocation ceremony was the following spring at a convention center downtown. My parents had RSVP'd. I had reserved 2 seats for them in the second row. The seats were empty when I walked across the stage. 3 days later I found out, from a photo my aunt posted on Facebook, that my parents had taken Gavin to dinner that same evening at a restaurant in the Beltline to celebrate his promotion to senior manager. Same night, probably the same hour, I was shaking the hand of the regional CPA president with an empty row of chairs behind me. I thought about that for a moment in the coffee shop. Then I thought about the signed security log sitting on the USB drive in my bag. I put on my coat and went back to the office. The professional conduct committee hearing was held in a neutral boardroom at a downtown office tower. Not a courtroom, but close enough. The table was long and the chairs were ergonomic, and the fluorescent lighting was the particular shade that makes everyone look like they're already in trouble. Ms. Kwan, the committee chair, was a CPA fellow with 30 years in professional regulation. She had a reputation for precision that made senior partners nervous. She opened the session without ceremony. Gavin performed extraordinarily well, for someone who had spent the previous 10 days constructing a house of cards. He spoke about his concern for me. He mentioned that my deteriorating professional judgment had been apparent to those close to me for some time. He submitted his package of documentation, a transcripts discrepancy report, fabricated correspondence from a university registrar, and a certification letter purportedly from CPA Canada's registrations office, dated 9 years ago, stating that my articling hours had not been completed and my designation had been issued in error. He spoke quietly and with great feeling. He looked at my parents when he needed to collect himself. Then my parents were called. My father gave his testimony in the tone he used in business meetings, measured, authoritative, entirely certain of himself. He described receiving, years ago, a notice from CPA Canada, indicating that an error had been discovered in my designation records. He described his distress at this discovery. He described at length his concern that I had knowingly concealed this from the people I served. He was composed. He was credible. He was lying under oath in a regulated professional proceeding. My mother cried. Actual tears, the product of a talent I had never fully appreciated until that moment. She spoke about her love for me and how painful it had been to come forward. She used the phrase, as her mother, 3 times. She pressed a handkerchief against her face at the appropriate moments. I did not object. I did not interject. I sat at the respondent's table and let every single word go into the official record. Miss Kwan asked me if I wished to respond. I said, not yet. She frowned, slightly. She looked down at the submission package in front of her. She picked up the certification letter. She read it again, and then the color left her face in a way that was visible to everyone in the room. She stood. She said she needed to step out briefly. She picked up the folder and walked through the side door into the anteroom. The room went very quiet. Gavin straightened his cufflinks. He glanced back at my parents, with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for something to finally go his way. He had about 15 minutes of confidence left. Miss Kwan returned with 2 other committee members and a woman I recognized as senior legal counsel for CPA Alberta. They sat down. Miss Kwan did not look at Gavin, she looked at me. She stated for the record that the certification letter submitted as the primary piece of documentary evidence bore the signature of a former director of registrations at CPA Canada, an individual retired from that role 14 months before the date printed on the letter. It was not possible for this person to have signed this document on this date. Furthermore, Miss Kwan had been present at a professional development session I had delivered at the Calgary chapter the previous spring. A technical presentation on forensic accounting methodology that drew on, and she noted this specifically, a level of applied expertise that an individual operating under fraudulent credentials could not have produced. She stated that what had been submitted to this committee was a fabricated document, and that submitting fabricated documents to a CPA professional regulatory body was a criminal matter under the Criminal Code of Canada. My representative, a senior advocate from a downtown firm who had said almost nothing for 2 hours, stood up and placed Tanner's photographs on the table. The telephoto image, the sign-in log, a forensic timeline prepared by a digital specialist, showing that the fraudulent documents had been created on a workstation registered to Gavin's firm during the precise window when his signature placed him physically in that building. My representative noted, calmly, that if the committee wished to confirm this independently, they could formally compel production of the building's biometric access records. These would indicate exactly which registered keycard had been scanned at the relevant entrance at the relevant time. Gavin said something that wasn't a word. He put both hands on the edge of the table. He looked at my parents in a way I had never seen from him before, something underneath the performance, something frightened and very young. Then he turned back to the room and started talking very quickly. He said it wasn't his idea. He said he had been pressured. He said there were people at his firm with access to his office, who could have used his computer, who had reason to set him up. He said he wanted a lawyer present. He said the sign-in log could have been altered. He said the photographs proved nothing. He said a great deal. None of it coherent. All of it recorded in the official transcript of the proceeding. Miss Kwan let him finish. Then she asked the RCMP liaison officer, who had been sitting silently against the far wall for the entire proceeding, to step forward. My brother was escorted from the room in handcuffs. He was still talking when the door closed behind him. The silence that followed was the kind you carry with you. Miss Kwan looked at my parents. She informed them that their affidavits now constituted evidence in a potential criminal fraud investigation, and that any devices used to communicate about the complaint, before or during the process, were subject to production. The RCMP officer returned, and placed evidence bags on the table in front of my parents. My father's face went the color of old cement. He demanded to know whether the officer had any idea who he was. He started to say something further. Nobody in the room responded. My mother said nothing. For the first time all morning, she said absolutely nothing. I stood. I removed a document from my bag and placed it on the table in front of both of my parents without looking at them. It was a restraining order, signed and filed that morning. I gave the second copy to my representative. Then I picked up my bag and walked out. I thought it was over. 4 days later, a text arrived from a blocked number. It told me the investigation would be slow, that civil action could drag through the courts for years, and that my firm's reputation in this city would take considerable time to recover from a public complaint, even a dismissed one. I did not reply. But I noted that Gavin's release conditions, secured on a $200,000 surety my father had pledged against his development company's line of credit, included a specific prohibition on electronic contact with any party connected to the complaint. He was not to access the internet or communicate with anyone on the restricted list. I knew him. I knew exactly what he could not resist. I sent a message to my mother's email address. It appeared to be a confidential, preliminary settlement document from a representative of one of my highest profile clients. It referenced a settlement amount, specific case details, and a link to a secure document portal, one that appeared to lead to my firm's private client vault. The link was a digital honeypot built by a cybersecurity consultant I had retained the day after the hearing. It logged the device hardware ID, the geolocation, and the precise access timestamp of anyone who clicked it. It didn't open anything. It just watched and recorded. Gavin clicked it from my mother's iPad at 11:23 p.m. The log placed the device at my parents' property in Elbow Valley. I forwarded the log to the RCMP liaison officer at 7 o'clock the next morning. By 9, the RCMP were at the property. Gavin had violated his release conditions and committed a new count of fraud involving unauthorized computer access. His bail was revoked. The Crown opposed any further release. The investigators also informed my father that because the unauthorized access had originated from a device registered at his address. And because his pledged surety was already connected to the original offense, the line of credit he had guaranteed was now frozen pending a formal review of whether it constituted facilitation of the underlying fraud. My father, standing in the foyer of his house, in the morning light, looked at my brother and said that he was not going to lose a company he had spent 30 years building, because Gavin was incapable of doing a single thing with any discipline. He said it with complete clarity, no hesitation, no visible grief. Gavin looked at my father in a way I imagine he had been privately afraid of his entire life. I deleted their contact information that evening. Every number, every email, every trace of connection. I drove home along the river, with the windows slightly open and the cold air coming in, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, the particular relief of having nothing left to protect myself from. People ask me how I managed to sit at that table for 2 hours while my parents said what they said under oath. They ask if it hurt. They want to know if I broke down afterward. I did cry. Once. That evening, alone in my office with the lights off and the city glowing amber through the windows. I cried for the family I had spent years trying to earn a legitimate place in. I did not cry for long. That kind of grief has its own quality, fast and total, like setting down something you have been carrying uphill without noticing the weight of it. Then I made tea and I went back to my desk. What I learned from all of it is not complicated, but it took me years to see it clearly enough to say aloud. The first thing is that obligation and love are not the same thing. We're taught, especially in families that project a particular image to the world, that endurance is loyalty, that tolerating treatment from the people you're biologically connected to is a form of devotion. It is not. Love does not require your compliance. It does not ask you to make yourself smaller in exchange for being kept. If someone in your life only values the version of you that serves them, that is not a relationship. That is a transaction, and you are allowed to close the account. You owe nothing to people who only love the version of you that submits. The second thing is that the favored child is not safe. I watched my brother perform the role of the protected one his entire life. The resources, the praise, the shelter of my father's reputation. I thought it was advantage. It was exposure. The moment Gavin became a liability rather than an asset, my father pivoted without visible effort or apparent pain. The protected child is not loved without conditions. They are useful, until the precise moment they are not. The scapegoat, for all her disadvantages, is already free. She stopped needing their approval out of pure necessity long before the golden child ever had to consider whether that approval was worth wanting. The third thing is the one that sounds simplest and is actually the hardest to follow. You do not win against people like this by escalating. You do not win by demanding acknowledgement, or waiting for an apology they are structurally incapable of giving, or trying to out-argue them in a room where they control the terms. They don't respond to confrontation the way reasonable people do. They absorb it and redirect it and use the energy of it against you. You win by being so completely excellent at what you do that the lies become transparent on contact with the record. You win by documenting everything in complete silence, building your evidence with patience, and then stepping back far enough to let people demonstrate exactly who they are. In high resolution, on the official transcript, in front of the people who have the authority to act on what they see. The greatest thing you will ever do for yourself is look at the people who tried to dismantle you, feel absolutely nothing except a quiet recognition, and turn back toward your actual life. My firm is doing well. The complaint was formally dismissed with a written finding of bad faith. Several of my clients sent notes afterward. One sent flowers. I put them in the front window, where the afternoon light comes in from the west. My brother's firm did not survive the CPAB audit. The shortfall was confirmed, the matter referred for prosecution, and the firm dissolved before the following spring. My father sold his development company to a larger group about a year and a half later. I heard this from my aunt in passing. Not as news she was delivering, just a fact she mentioned the way you mention weather that has already moved through. I have not spoken to any of them since the day I placed that restraining order on the table and walked out into the cold. I want to be honest about something, because I've seen versions of stories like this told as clean triumphs, where justice arrives on schedule, everything resolves, and the person telling it emerges without a mark. This is not that. This is simply what happened when I stopped organizing my life around people who were organizing theirs against me. If any part of this sounds familiar, the endless accommodation, the asymmetrical effort, the way you have quietly learned to make yourself tolerable to people who should be asking themselves whether they deserve your presence. I am not going to tell you what to do. Only you know what is true in your own situation. But I will tell you what I noticed. The noise of maintaining those relationships had been so constant for so long that I had lost the ability to hear myself think. When it finally went quiet, I found out I had considerably more clarity than I had realized. Sometimes the most important line you will ever draw does not look dramatic. Nobody gets arrested. Nobody goes pale in a boardroom. Sometimes it is simply a number deleted, a door closed gently, a morning where you make your coffee without bracing for whatever comes next. That quiet is something you are allowed to choose. You are allowed to choose it, even when no one around you understands the reason. You are allowed to choose it, even if it costs you something that was never really yours to hold. I chose it, and I would choose it the same way every single time.